in this panel discussion, what we'll do is we'll talk to our customers who have gone through implementation of our solutions and kind of learn more from them in terms of if you're getting ready for or just thinking about implementing a contract management tool, what are the things you need to be thinking about, if not worried about. So you are ready to actually start the process and get the value of a contract lifecycle management tool. All right. So my first question, you're trying to solve a business case or a use case with contracting, and there are different use cases. Some might have a repository issue where you don't have visibility into your existing contracts, and someone might be struggling with, hey, we have long authoring cycles. We need visibility into the process. So my first question to the panelists, and I'll start with Sean. In terms of at Rockwell, what were the key challenges which you were trying to solve with contract lifecycle automation or implementing our iContract tool?
A lot of the key factors that we had to consider, one was we did have a contract repository. In terms of searchability and metadata, very, very limited. And we are a manufacturer of electronics. So there's a lot of compliance issues for us, a lot of RoHS, REACH, things of that nature. So we really had no good tool to be able to go and query the data that we had about our contracts to make sure that we had clauses for each of these compliance issues, or that the wording was accurate or up to date. So one of the things that we were very interested in the tool that we selected was, what's the ability of this tool to capture metadata such that we can search on terminology or words, that we can, as well as the typical things of, when is it, who is the contract with? Is this a master agreement versus other pieces of contractual documents that go along with that master agreement? So that was one of the key things that we were looking for. What we also wanted was, one of the issues that we faced is that we have no metrics or data on our contract authoring process. So there just was this sort of natural that it was a long time. Now what that long time was that it was measured in days, weeks, or years. Nobody could really nail that down. And what we tended to have happen were contracts kind of tended to die on the vine. So we would have the pricing agreements and that sort of thing, so we could move forward with pricing, but we did not necessarily nail down that process. So there was a lot of holes, and our legal folks were really concerned about that. And so we were looking for a tool that would allow us to automate that authoring process, and then also give us tools where we could not just store the document, but be able to search and find things related to that.
Sure. Great. Thanks. So moving on to John. And John, you have an interesting story in terms of, I believe you have done this, implementing this repository, implementing this process.
We loved it so much, we did it twice.
So I wanted to get your inputs on, what were the key challenges which you couldn't solve earlier, and what were the areas which you were trying to focus on?
Initially, 3 years ago, we had modest goals. We didn't really have a strategic sourcing group. We just had a couple sourcing leads, and I was the attorney, and we were very reactive, and we couldn't manage product life cycles. That was the problem we wanted to address. We had a flat database, static, you could run queries, but it couldn't tell you when a contract was about to expire. You had to actually, as I said earlier, typically we got a call from an internal customer telling us that the contract was about to expire. Our oops, it just auto-renewed. We missed the deadline to avoid that. So we wanted to have a system that would actually proactively help us manage the contract life cycle. But we messed up we had data issues.
Sure.
We didn't clean up the data before we dumped it into another contract database. And going from a flat database to a hierarchical database, there were things we should have done. So we ended up with a system that was broken, and at that point it wasn't even achieving its original purpose of being a contract repository, because it couldn't find things. And of course it didn't help us with any of our other, more ambitious goals either.
Let's go to Matt and hear from Matt in terms of, Matt, what were the key challenges you were trying to solve from a contracting tool perspective?
The key for us was to route the contract, right? Most of us do it manually. It sits in somebody's inbox and it's there for 3 months, and you lose it or don't know where it is. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to actually automate that routing process by using a tool, so we knew where those contracts were, and speed up the process to get that contract in place. What I always stated was, the longer that contract does not get in place, we lose money, right? We negotiate new rates. So my pitch to legal and everybody else was we're losing money by using the manual process. We needed to automate that, make it streamlined, make it more efficient, know where these contracts are, and then just approve it by checking a box or clicking a button and speed up the process. So that was our challenge, was to speed up the contracting process, the approval contracting process within our organization.
Right. So let's move to the next section in terms of, I think I was talking about, okay, great, you want to implement a tool, you want to solve a challenge. How to do it right at the first time? And I'll go to John and probably ask that question. So John, you have experience of going through this process twice, in fact, and of course moving from a legacy system where you had some digitization of the contracts. So what are the best practices you would recommend, more from the data standpoint, getting ready for a contract lifecycle automation tool? What are the best practices you will suggest to the audience?
Well, I sort of inherited the first attempt at automation, and there was no planning. You basically had one person who worked with the vendor to just unceremoniously dump the data from one database into another, and in the process dropped several fields that we had tracked, amendment number, SOW number. These weren't needed in the new fancy hierarchical database, but on a day-to-day basis, that's what people referred to, SOW3, Amendment 2 to this contract, and suddenly you'd look it up in the repository and it was hard to find. What we've done, when we did it the second time, as part of a bigger picture, looking at our processes, we're looking at what data fields we want to capture. I mean, we learned the obvious lesson from the first time to clean up the data. Just as I said in the earlier session, one of the biggest problems was in a flat database, you can spell a supplier's name 5 different ways, and Allied Widget, as long as it's pretty much there, they all show up alphabetically in the list and you can find them. We ended up with 5 different suppliers named Allied Widget with different versions of the spelling, with 25 contracts spread over those 5 suppliers, and the hierarchy was broken. Because we didn't look at the data before it was dumped into the second database. So Sachin and I have put a lot of time and energy into it.
So thanks, John. So come back to Sean. I think, Sean, you already have a repository when you went in with Zycus. And I think one of the key challenges in the contracts were there was no defined hierarchy. So kind of a follow-up on John's point, what you would recommend as, like getting ready for a new contract tool, what do you need to do to clean up the data? Because you might have like different versions of the amendments, SOWs, and if you don't have a kind of a definition of what a contract is, you really can get into different areas.
Actually, for us, I mean, we kind of just decided to avoid that whole struggle. I mean, we do have search capabilities within our existing tool, and so rather than kind of fight that particular battle, where we really saw we had data issues was more in the configuration side. So, it was one of those things where we've been doing strategic sourcing for a number of years, so we kind of thought we had it all figured out. We had a standard process. And so what we quickly figured out was, well, no, we actually have 4 or 5 standard processes, and they all differ. And so where we had a lot of struggle was coming up with that, here's how it's going to work. Here's the workflow. Here are the approval levels. We wanted to get down to a clause-by-clause capability, because if certain clauses change, then we would want that to go to legal. If other clauses change it, we would want it to go to our VP of procurement. And so we really spent a lot more time on the configurable data, rather than even trying to go after the contracts that are already in the repository. We may circle back to that, but our feeling right now is that, let's get the process straightened out up front. Let's start contracting in the tool, and we'll worry about those other documents later on as we go along, because at least we can find them reasonably well today.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great option to move forward in terms of if you need that contract ever right, come and clean it up and kind of set the hierarchy right. But I think when we started as Celgene, though the contracts were there, but the information was not there in one single place, right?
Correct.
So I think, Matt, if you can throw some light on how you went about, kind of what are the best practices you need to look forward to when you're trying to consolidate the data. And I believe it took some time to get all the data in one place.
Yeah, I mean, we got a sort of a data dump, and we put a team together to sort of look at the contracts and sort of marry them up to what they were. Was it a master service agreement? Was it an amendment to a master service agreement, and sort of get that all in line before we sort of handed it off to Sasha and his team to get it up into the database there in the contract module. But it does take time and effort to do that. It's a lot of manual work that needs to be done to bring that all together. It was just unfortunate that over the years as we grew quicker, we were just dumping contracts into a shared drive or something like that, and then we had to pull that all out and sort of manage it and get it to where it needed to be. But then we sort of took the approach that Sean did was, okay, we put it there, we're not going to get it 100%, but let's move forward and put a process in place for new contracts coming up that we're going to have it right going forward.
Yep. Great. So, Sean, you got to mention about the process change, and it's easier said than done. And I've sat in multiple conversations where I have legal in the room and sourcing in the room trying to discuss what is the right process, how to set up authoring, who needs to review what.
Yep.
And I believe you went through a longer cycle to kind of bring, and given the size of your organization, I'm sure the sourcing team is so big. So can you talk a little bit about how to actually go and bring everybody on consensus on what a process is for contracting and what should guide the process?
Well, and we kind of were surprised at how hard it was to implement, not from a technology perspective, but just from an internal process perspective, because right from the get-go, we had legal on board. We had a great working relationship with them. Our general counsel for the company was 100% behind this product. They said, this is where we want to go. Our VP of procurement was right on board. But where we stumbled was really just, getting that buy-in from across the various directors, and everybody kind of did things differently. Once we got that sort of resolved, then it went much better after that. And what we engaged them with was be part of the solution. So basically we were saying, hey, the winner in this is not going to be any one of you. It's going to be some combination of them all. So here's your opportunity to get in on the ground level. Let's do this thing right the first time. And then it became a kind of a collaborative process. And we're thinking of doing things now that hadn't even occurred to us at the very beginning of it. Some of the work around fallback positions, the ability to measure that contracting cycle and get information about, hey, this sourcing manager never pushes hard for the upfront position. They're always immediately go to the fallback position, so that we can start to get an idea of what some of the behavior that is around how that process works. So what initially kind of surprised us that we were having such a hard time ended up being a positive thing, I think, in the end, is that we got that buy-in, we got that stakeholder ownership of this whole process, and so it's been going very well since then.
Yeah, and you're right in terms of, technology is just an enabler of the process, right? Mm-hmm. It can automate the process, but if the adoption is not there from a process standpoint, you will have limited visibility in terms of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And I believe you also went one level deeper in terms of identifying ownership at clause level, so the review process is much smoother, right?
Right. Our company right now is really concentrating a lot on risk management and really being able to identify, do we have checks and balances in place? Do we have an auditable process for, how contracts are written, how contracts are approved? And so the clause-by-clause management piece of the iContract tool really appealed to us because we do have, depending on the contract that we're doing, it may not just be legal and procurement that's part of this process. If it's a product-related contract for, say, factored product that's with a Rockwell name brand, we need to get the product businesses involved. And so now we have a tool where we can easily route those contracts, get that buy-in, get that sign-off, and now we've got an auditable document. The other piece for us was, as part of that process, all of those conversations that are part of that negotiation process are now in the tool. So we don't have to worry about emails that are sitting out there or other documents that are sitting out there. That negotiation process happens within the tool, and once that contract is signed and once we have that finished document in the system, then we can get rid of all of that information that's no longer pertinent anymore. It was part of the discussion, but it's no longer required, and we can delete it now that we have that finished contract. So there was a lot of people that were very interested in that process, and that helped us sell it in the organization.
Great. And John, you never had that issue.
No.
Being an attorney.
No, we have a much simpler. I mean, listening to the list of approvals, I'm legal. General counsel's office does their thing, but as far as the procurement group goes, I have to sign off legal, and the sourcing lead signs off. The only approval we need outside of the sourcing department is the budget owner. So one or more VPs who own the budget. So typically we would just, before we even had a tool, it was a fairly simple process. You send an email to the VP and you get an approval email back, or you walk it over and you get his signature on a paper form, or you attach the email to the paper form, and then the sourcing lead signs off on it, and I sign off on it, and it's done. So there was only one point of contact outside sourcing, so we didn't have usually long delays at the approval stage.
Great. And Matt, any suggestions on, I think it seems like a pretty straightforward process in your case also, or you had the usual stuff in terms of what the process should be? And
yeah, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. I mean, I would just say that the approval process, ties into the signature authority policy. I don't know if anybody has a signature authority policy.
Yeah, we have that too.
So it has to go up to a certain level based on the dollar volume of the contract, and that's where we were having, some issues, is getting that correct in the system to get it up to the right approval limit to be signed off on. And not every contract has a dollar value, right?
Yep,
and then what
that's
to do with that, right? So we had to figure that out, who it needed to go to, and how you were able to bypass the routing that the system put in for you, how you bypass that and get it to the right person for that sign off to happen.
I actually have a kind of follow-up question related to that, and more from sourcing standpoint. You go through all the trouble of implementing a repository, implementing a process, or automating the tool and all, and of course you get visibility. So how that visibility is helping you from a sourcing standpoint to take better decisions, identify maverick spend? Can you talk on that part?
Yeah, I mean, with the visibility, you can run some good reporting and some metrics off of the tool. So you see what is, maverick spend, what isn't maverick spend, who's compliant, who's not, what departments are, and then you can go back and sort of talk to them about, hey, if you're not compliant to the policy, why? What are we running into? Why you're not putting contracts in place or using the preferred suppliers and things like that. So what I see is that visibility helps us target certain opportunities within the organization to better put contracts in place or source it a little bit better.
And hope there are no auto renewals now.
And what we did from a Rockwell perspective is we manually sync up our homegrown contract process with SAP, and so we make sure that there's that the contracts we sign in the Saves tool are also put into SAP. I mean, that is just a cumbersome process. So our approach was, let's get we implemented iSource and iContract, so we've really automated the whole sourcing front end of this thing, and that was some pretty good change management. So the idea was, let's get it up, let's get it running. And then what we're doing over the next 9 months is building the contract capability in SAP, and then we'll look at automating that interface. Because again, for us, whenever we try and go too far too fast, we kind of get out in front of the headlights of the organization and we run into trouble. And so what we're kind of doing right now is we've got the front end built. Let's build the back-end capability in SAP, and then, because there's a lot of things that we need to think about. Right now, for example, validity dates. So just because I've got a contract in iContract, do I want it valid today? How do I want to let the system know I want to load this contract now into SAP? So there's some things that we're still kind of thinking about and walking through.
Yeah, I'm sure these are the few things which you need to address also from a termination standpoint. Like if you're terminating the contract, then what will be the impact on your purchasing system?
Right. Well, and we're also finding too, we're sourced to pay. So even though I don't own the accounts payable piece, they're part of our process. And so right now, just to get where we are, there's a lot of ongoing negotiations with the accounts payable folks, making them understand how the process worked, that it was kind of bulletproof, and here's what we've done to address risk and controls issue and audit issues. And that's gone well, but initially it was kind of, they're like, this is new and bright and shiny, so it must not be good. And sourcing and procurement are recommending it, so it must really be bad for us.
I'm sure it has its own challenges. One thing I wanted to ask all three of you, and probably I'll Start with you, Sean, again. Definitely, there are different, as we saw, like, one use case which was started more from sourcing standpoint. Second was let's have all our contracts in place. Third, more focus on processes standpoint. So if you have to evaluate like a contract lifecycle management tool, what are the, I would say, few points which you would like to kind of give to audience in kind of an approach more on how to go about evaluating what you should be looking out for and how to figure out a solution which meets your requirements?
We did a pretty thorough, at least I think it was, evaluation process. We had a long list of about 20 suppliers. We weeded that down to a short list of 4, which we did put through a formal RFP process. And the key pieces that we were looking for, we were interested in an integrated suite. I mean, we definitely had struggled with integrating multiple different applications, and I really didn't want to go down that path. Although we didn't say absolutely not, but it was one of the things we were trying to avoid. The other piece for me is my user base varies tremendously. We've got people that are power users that are in these tools every day. They're sophisticated users. They have no trouble with spreadsheets and complex processes. And then I got other users that are going to be going in there maybe once a year or twice a year, once a quarter. And so I needed a user interface that was clear and concise enough to make all those people happy. So for us, those were some of the key issues that we were looking at in terms of a tool. And then obviously that handled the complexity of our process and the multiple fingers in the pie of the approval process. So those were some of the key factors that we looked at.
And now, since you're rolling the tool to the sales side of the house also, right, for managing the contract, so what they were part of like the requirement gathering? I mean, does it make sense to bring everybody on board and just say, hey, tell me what your requirements are? It's just like take a holistic approach of here's what the basic infrastructure we need and then try to fit it in.
What we did is we really did a lot of stakeholder management in terms of who are our internal customers, and then we kind of broke it down. So the sales guys, although they were very interested, we kind of dealt with them separately. So it's like, let's get this tool up and running, and then we'll deal with yours. And actually, it gave us a chance to work with you guys to do a sales-oriented, because we were kind of showing them the supplier screens and saying, well, this will say, customer instead, and they just weren't getting it. And so, so we worked with Zycus. They put together a sales-oriented presentation, and our sales guys are really interested from a repository perspective. And so, but we're going to do them in a later phase. We also phased our regions, so we're going to get North America done first, then we'll look at EMEA and Asia Pacific next. So that's the way we did it. We just kind of looked at who are the major internal stakeholders, and then how do we break it down into manageable chunks.
Great, thanks. So John, coming back to you, what are your key recommendations from evaluation standpoint? How to, what are the key things you should be looking at?
Well, basically 2 things. One, he mentioned the if you don't get buy-in from all your users, it's not going to work. And we had, even with the other tool, beyond the data problems, we had people who 30 years in the telecom industry and had come over to the sourcing side and was great at negotiating contracts, but he'd rather stick a contract in a drawer. And so you have the contract in a drawer problem if the tool is not usable. And so you need things that are simple, straightforward, don't vary functions and contextual menus, and so we needed that. And also now we're finally sort of after the fact going through all of our process mapping, figuring out how we want to do things and standardizing our workflows. And so you need to make sure you have a tool that can handle all of the steps in your workflow efficiently.
Yeah, I think they did a good job of covering it. I would touch on that. Ease of use is the key for us, both internally and also with your suppliers. You need to make sure that your suppliers view this as an easy tool to use. If not, they're not going to want to use it. They're going to want to go back to the manual process, and then everything just goes awry. So ease of use was the big concern for us, because what you're up against there is a manual process where everything's in Word. They just take it out, they build it, they email it. So that's what you're up against. You have to have a tool that's going to be easier than what you currently have today. So that was the key. And then also integration, and a tool that we were able to put sort of a routing function in there that it was able to route through the companies and get the proper approvals. So they were the 2 things.
Well, and just the one thing we're also doing is we're putting adoption metrics in place too, so we can actually measure how many contracts are being put in the tool, because that's always an issue for us. I mean, everybody, even though they all say yes, we're all for change, when it comes right down to it, they're not, and you always have to be able to show, all right, people, it's live now, this is what you should be using, and you're not, and be able to really highlight that. So it's kind of the enforcement piece of the whole process.
I think adoption is
training, right?
Adoption is definitely a challenge because end of the day you define a process and it's a change management. So from a change management standpoint, what do you recommend? How it really works? Is it more like you kind of keep on showing the metrics again and again and try to their management, or because yours is such a diverse organization, it might be hard to just I mean, of course you track the adoption, but how do you make sure that the managers kind of have buy-in and kind of see those metrics?
Actually, one of the things that Rockwell has done over the last 2 or 3 years is we have a strategic framework that comes from our CEO. And so what we do is we drive from him, it goes to our senior VP, it goes from that senior VP to our VP, and it goes right on down the road to an individual buyer, sourcing manager, whatever. And so their metrics and their goals line up. And so it becomes a evaluation discussion. It's like, hey, you were supposed to be part of the implementation of this tool. We're implementing this tool to support this strategic objective. Why aren't you on board? And we found that to be extremely effective. We struggled with some of the SAP stuff we implemented years ago, and over the last 2 years, those are right on their evaluation, and it's really helped us. And so we've taken that same approach with the Zycus tools.
Great. So I thank all of you for your time, and thanks audience for attending.